My name is Tamara Williams, and I am the Executive Director of PLU's Wang Center for Global and Community Engaged Education, which together with PLU's nationally ranked Peace Corps Prep program is privileged to sponsor and coordinate today's two-part celebration of service, during which PLU and our extended community collectively honor the memory of U.S. Ambassador to Libya, Christopher Chris Stevens, who was killed serving his country on September 11th, 2012 in Benghazi, Libya. This evening, we continue our community's honoring of Ambassador Stevens with a keynote presentation by global public health expert and activist focused on women and LGBTIQ+ community health worldwide, Ami Bishop, who, as she will share, served with the late ambassador in the Peace Corps in Morocco and embraces him as a friend. Before proceeding with the evening's program, and for the benefit of those who were unable to be with us earlier today, I would like to share a few brief remarks about the ambassador and his approach to diplomacy, which underscore the reasons why the PLU community has chosen to uplift his memory in our biennial celebration of public and foreign service. And this will be our 5th biennial event honoring the former ambassador. Writing in the Huffington Post just months after the ambassador's assassination, Lucas Welch spoke about what struck him most about the ambassador, and I quote, "What struck him most was how well Chris Stevens listened. He believed deeply in quintessential American ideals such as freedom of expression and religious tolerance, but he was humble. He recognized that our action as a nation did not always live up to those ideals, and he believed we had to constantly listen to the people we affected and work with them to better align our words and our deeds." A recent article in Just Security described his approach to diplomacy as cutting edge. And I quote, "He underscored the centrality of human relationships of America's national security interests. His death revealed long-standing shortcomings in adapting US engagement abroad to the more dynamic and dangerous environments in which civilian foreign policy practitioners must now live and operate." Underscoring the ambassador's human and relational approach to the very hard work of diplomacy, finally, this same article cites a tribute written by the ambassador's father in June of 2013. "He died doing what he loved most, working to build bridges of understanding and mutual respect between the people of the United States and the people of the Middle East. He was successful because he embodied the traits that have always endeared America to the world: a commitment to democratic principles, a respect for others, regardless of race, religion, or culture. He amazed and impressed people by walking the streets with the lightest of escorts, sitting in sidewalk cafes, chatting with passersby. There was a risk to being accessible," the ambassador's father, Jan Stevens, wrote about his son. "Chris knew it and accepted it." The purpose of this keynote presentation, in the spirit of the family of Ambassador Stevens' wishes, is to continue the work that Ambassador Stevens began, which is to prepare students to serve in this way, to build bridges through increased understanding and in-depth knowledge of the complexity of the world, a commitment to mutual respect and care for others, their communities, and the earth in the interest of fostering world peace. Before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge briefly all those that have given their time, skills, direction, ongoing support, and resource to make this event possible. I'm especially grateful to the event planning team, which included Rosemary Reynolds in the Wang Center, PLU's Department of Marketing and Communications, for their ongoing guidance and support, the PLU alumni who served or continue to serve worldwide and lent their stories to our slideshow, PLU's Division of Advancement for their support in helping us reach PLU alumni, to John Strusenberg and instructional support for this event, and finally to the Peace Corps alumni and current students that have taken time to be part of the program And last but not least, my gratitude to Dr. Rose McKenney, Professor of Geosciences and Environmental Studies at PLU, for collaborating on this important event. Regarding tonight's program, I just want to let you know that following the introduction of our keynote speaker, we expect the presentation to proceed for approximately 45 minutes, followed by a period where we invite our audience to ask questions using the Zoom Q&A function, which you can find the icon at the bottom of your screen. We invite you to add your questions as they come up at any time of the presentation, and Ami and I will get back to those questions at the end of her talk. Without further delay, I invite a current student at PLU, Sarah Calvin Stupfel, a double major in Hispanic Studies and Global Studies at PLU with minors in Gender, Sexuality, and Race Studies and History, to introduce our special guest for this evening. Welcome, Sarah, and thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Calvin Stupfel, and it is my pleasure to introduce Ami Bishop as our keynote speaker for this year's Chris Stevens Celebration of Service. Ami Bishop is a human rights advocate and global health leader with professional experience in more than 20 countries. She holds master's degrees in social work and public health, both from Columbia University. She was a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco in the early 1980s, serving alongside Chris Stevens himself, who was a good friend of hers. From 1989 to 2014, she worked for PATH, a nonprofit global health organization, and held numerous technical and leadership positions, largely focused on HIV, tuberculosis, and women's health. Ms. Bishop is an adjunct clinical instructor at the University of Washington's Department of Global Health and an invited member of the Civic Council for a program of the University of Washington Jackson School of International Studies, representing perspectives on human rights for LGBTQ+ people. She is also on the advisory panel of the Women in Global Health Seattle chapter. Today, through her work with Outright Action International, a global LGBTQ+ human rights organization, and as an independent global health and human rights consultant, Ms. Bishop focuses her public service efforts on the intersection of health access and human rights for LGBTQ+ people globally. From 2008 to 2017, she worked on Outright's board of directors and was board co-chair for 3 years. In 2019, she authored Outright's report titled Harmful Treatment, the Global Reach of So-Called Conversion Therapy. Currently, she is the Senior Research Advisor for Outright Action International and the author of its recent report, Vulnerability Amplified, the Impact of COVID-19 on LGBTIQ people globally, which happens to be the topic of this evening's lecture. So without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Ami Bishop.
Thank you so much. First to the whole team, PLU. It's to me to invite me to do this, and to Sarah, of course, for that kind introduction. I just want to say to all of you first, and to the organizers, that I'm really deeply honored to be asked to speak today, a lecture series dedicated to the memory of my friend Chris Stevens and to the public service that he truly exemplified. In that spirit, before I move to the main part of my talk, I just thought I'd share a few reflections about Chris and about my own journey from Peace Corps volunteer to a long career in global health, and now as a human rights advocate for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and queer plus people around the world. So about Chris, you may have seen the photo of us together on the left there on the PLU website. It was taken on one of our many weekend hikes in the Middle Atlas Mountains in Morocco, circa 1984. And the other one was on a similar hike, and just was one of my favorite pictures of him. When I first met Chris during our training in 1983, his easy, laid-back California nature and understated sense of humor really endeared him to everyone pretty quickly during the first months of our training. I've recounted this before, but I believe it's safe to say that we were all especially impressed by his impeccably pressed and seemingly endless supply of khaki pants. It became a great source of amusement. How was he doing that? Speaking for myself, by our second year, I was quite sure he was receiving secret shipments of pants. In any case, he and I quickly became friends. We both had California roots, we were runners, and we shared a similar sense of humor. During our training, our observant Peace Corps training director mistakenly thought that we were dating, and he posted us in neighboring villages in the Middle Atlas Mountains. This turned out actually to be hugely important to me, and we were each other's main support during that first year. Growing up together, not realizing at the time what an incredibly formative period in our lives it would be. Our favorite pastime, aside from hiking in the hills around his village, which was something I couldn't do as a single woman, was comparing our latest cultural blunders, a ritual familiar to all Peace Corps volunteers. My favorite one of his was when he confused the hours of his town's one hammam, the public bath, and walked in on a bunch of half-dressed Berber women who went screaming from the front room. It was such a joy to share his town with him. It was called Wawizirt. He was so well liked by his community there. I'm sure that they were responding to the clear happiness and joy he took from immersing himself in their world. He was so committed to doing his best, and his Arabic was improving so much faster than the rest of us. About 6 months into our assignments, he came to visit me in my town, and my neighbors invited us for lunch. Very soon after we settled in, the mother and the family started poking me and asking me why Chris spoke Arabic so much better than I did. Why can't you speak like him? There's no question in my mind that Chris's Peace Corps experience, combined with his innate wonderful qualities, laid the foundation for the kind of diplomat he would become, and sort of as reflected in Tamara's opening remarks. He truly exemplified the sort of cultural intelligence that can be gained only through deep respect of others, through the hard work of learning another tongue, and through participating fully in new surroundings, by partaking in simple acts such as sitting on a tree stump in an olive grove to share tea with a Berber family, as we did several times on our hikes. With his untimely death, he left behind the finest testament there is to the power of total immersion into unfamiliar realities as a way of bridging and even solving the world's ills. His sort of diplomacy, I'm sure, was characterized by participation, respect, listening, learning, and finding shared humor, essentially by sharing his humanity. He already had those innate traits, but I have no doubt that his Peace Corps experience allowed those qualities to blossom, so that whether as a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco, or a diplomat in Egypt, or Syria, or Israel, or Libya, or finally as an ambassador, Chris was just as likely to be found on any given day sipping tea on a tree stump with the locals. You can turn off the slides now for a moment. As for me, I moved to Marrakesh during my second year of service. A summer project became my full-time assignment, and I helped start a program for kids with cerebral palsy in a hospital there. And that's how I became drawn to public health. Many, though not all of the conditions we saw were preventable. And while the staff of this hospital were supremely dedicated, they were constantly hampered by resource limitations and the significant poverty from which many of their patients came. Jumping ahead, after getting my master's degrees in public health and social work, I came out here to the Northwest in 1989 to join a relatively new small NGO called PATH, which now, as some of you might know, is a bit of a global health powerhouse. And indeed, I came out in many ways, having found love in New York with my partner, Renee. She and I will actually celebrate tomorrow 32 years together and 6 years of legal marriage. And we have 2 amazing sons now in their early 20s. Over the course of 25 years, I had an amazing career at PATH, dedicating the first 12 years or so primarily to women's health and cancer, women's cancers, before moving more into infectious diseases, mostly HIV and TB. Although along the way, my political consciousness continued to evolve, and I became more active in the fight for LGBTQ+ equality here in Washington State. My concern also continued to grow as to why LGBT people were never mentioned, never visible, never considered in the work that we were doing, that I was doing. And this is when I found what was then called the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, now called Outright Action International. I joined their board in 2008, and as Sarah recounted, served for 9 years there on the board of directors. I started meeting with LGBT plus activists during my so-called off hours when I traveled for PATH in China, Vietnam, Zambia, Tanzania, Ukraine, Kenya, and really across the world. And in 2014, with my departure from PATH after 2.5 decades, I decided to dedicate the remaining years of my career to global LGBTQ plus human rights. And so for the last 2 years, I've served as the senior researcher advisor there, as Sarah noted. We could have the slide again, please. Outright, by the way, is an amazing organization. And I really encourage you to look it up on the website and learn a bit more about us. Hold on one sec, sorry. We work, as I just draw your attention to the slide, we work in 3 areas: supporting and resourcing LGBTQ movements around the world, engaging in global and regional advocacy. We have quite a robust program working actually at the United Nations to work towards inclusion of LGBT rights into the global human rights agenda, and conducting research and documentation to fuel that advocacy. And our work in COVID-19 is actually a pretty good example of how all those pieces fit together. Before I get into describing that work, let me say a word about that acronym, LGBTIQ+, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and queer. It's imperfect and it's evolving. And really importantly, I want to emphasize that we're not a monolith. Depending on context and other intersecting identities, the people represented by these distinct letters could face widely different challenges. So please keep that in mind as I go along, even if I'm generally referring to the collective. So to the topic at hand, when the pandemic first hit almost exactly a year ago in this country, we knew that we had to act fast to characterize how the pandemic and the public health measures being taken to curb transmission were affecting LGBTQ lives in real time. We published our report in May 2020, so quite early on. Why were we so quick to act? Because we knew then what has become so excruciatingly apparent around the world now, that in times of crisis, those most marginalized will suffer disproportionately, that crises expose and exacerbate existing inequalities and injustices. We've certainly seen this in our own country in the way that the pandemic has hit Black and Brown communities hardest, and how those holding multiple identities that subject them to discrimination suffer even more. And in fact, some LGBT people are also at an increase of COVID-19 itself due to higher rates of underlying conditions whose root causes can be traced to hostile social environments, the so-called social determinants of health. The CDC, the US CDC, issued a report just recently noting that, quote, gay, lesbian, and bisexual people experience stigma and discrimination in their lives that can increase vulnerabilities to illness and limit the means to achieving optimal health and well-being. For many LGBTIQ people around the world, this is true for them as well, especially where our lives are still criminalized. You may not realize it, many Americans actually don't, but 68 countries in the world still criminalize same-sex relations, with 8 still having the death penalty. 45 countries still apply such laws to women, with 57 countries criminalizing in some way transgender people. This means that LGBTQ people in many places around the world really have no recourse when they face stigma, discrimination, or violence. They're disproportionately bullied in schools, leading to higher dropout rates, which of course then affects their economic prospects for the future. They may face hostility at home, leading to comparatively higher rates of homelessness, depression, and suicide compared to their straight counterparts. They face job discrimination and discrimination certainly in the health sector. As I mentioned, these injustices are worsened, of course, if you hold multiple intersecting identities that are routinely subjected to disparate treatment, whether based on gender, race, ethnicity, immigration status, disability, not to mention prevailing societal discrimination depending on where you live. In short, again, crises lay bare and worsen existing inequalities. So one might ask, why aren't health and humanitarian programs reaching LGBTQ people during crises like COVID-19, or even in routine health and development work? The answers are complex, but I think here are some of them. One of the answers to me is that most assistance assumes a straight traditional family structure when providing for services. Humanitarian relief in particular is populated by a number of faith-based organizations who may not have or want the competencies to reach LGBT communities. This is absolutely not true for all, and I want to emphasize that, but it also is a reality in our sector. And as Outright's executive director, Jessica Stern, often points out, we're a statistical minority, so why focus on us? The answer, of course, lies in the old adage that we're only as strong as the weakest link. That is, the strength of a humanitarian response system lies in its ability to truly leave no one behind. If people are left behind, then in fact, you're perpetuating an unequal system. And there's another dimension of this too. The field of women's rights and gender justice remains a work in progress. I just want to spend a moment on this particular point. The gendered impacts of emergencies have been widely studied in recent years, and viewing crises through a gender lens is certainly critical. There's no doubt that in recent crises, such as the Ebola epidemic, women were harder hit than men due to their overrepresentation among healthcare workers, as well as having primary caregiving responsibilities at home. But while many organizations and agencies in the health, development, and humanitarian sectors have adopted gendered approaches, gender continues to be narrowly defined within a cisgender women and girls framing. Such framing overlooks the specific barriers to support that LGBTIQ people may be facing due to their sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, and can often explicitly exclude them from being able to access this support. To ensure that emergency response efforts are truly equitable and effective, gender must be defined broadly enough to encompass diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, and gender expressions. Just this morning, actually, not even this morning, midday today, I was looking at the new Global Health 50/50 report that just came out. And in there, they looked at a range of organizations working in health and development. And one of the things that they found was of 201 organizations working in global health, only 26, 13%, published definitions of gender that recognize that the non-binary nature of gender. It's actually a little bit more than I expected. And only 10% of all organizations have programs that refer to transgender health. They didn't say, but I suspect that those programs are probably HIV programs rather than broader primary health care or more comprehensive kinds of health support. And sometimes humanitarian actors in times of crisis try to do the right thing, but because they're not thinking in these broader terms, they inadvertently exacerbate the situation. Let me just give you a couple of examples. After the 2010 Haitian earthquake, Outright and an HIV organization in Haiti called Serovi described how strategies meant to address genuine gender disparities in accessing food relief after the earthquake led to the unintended consequence of excluding many gay men and transgender people in need, as only cisgender women in some instances were allowed to collect food support. They were prioritizing women so that they would be sure that women were receiving food. The problem was that men who lived in households without female partners and transgender women whose documents did not match their gender identity could not access food, while lesbian and bisexual women reported that they didn't feel safe in some of the chaotic food lines. And last spring, speaking of the COVID epidemic, when COVID hit Latin America, Panama issued complex guidelines mandating separate shopping days for men and women to reduce potential disease exposure. 2 cities in Colombia followed suit. And do you know what happened? Transgender people started getting abused and arrested for violating the mandates and curfews, being accused of collecting food on the wrong day and giving an excuse to law enforcement to rough them up. So this is all to say that this is why we jumped in early to start to document what was happening in our communities. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. What we did over a 3-week period at the end of April, sort of mid-April to the very beginning of May, was we interviewed 59 people across 38 countries. Even though it was a relatively small sample, we tried to ensure geographic spread as well as diversity and identity. So among the people we interviewed, just under a third were transgender, more than a third were lesbian or gay, and the remaining people identified as bisexual, queer, gender nonconforming, or gender fluid, or didn't specify. And we had 3 intersex interviewees. So what did we find? The key message I want to share before going into the details is that LGBTIQ plus people globally are really suffering, whether directly from the virus or from the economic fallout that has resulted in job loss, hunger, lack of access to other critical health care, increases in violence, and threats to the survival of crucial grassroots advocacy organizations and service organizations. Overall, we identified 7 main themes, and I'm going to show you some photos of some of the people we interviewed because I don't want you to come away from this evening without really seeing who I'm talking about. First slide, please. Next slide, sorry. So the first theme, and probably the most dominant theme really, was devastation of livelihoods and increasing food insecurity. What really stood out for us, and remember, we did these interviews in April, what really stood out for us was how quickly LGBTIQ people moved into food insecurity. And food support was not always available equally, and also availability didn't actually mean access. Part of the issue, as I mentioned earlier, is that LGBT people are overrepresented in the ranks of the poor, and we dominate the informal work sector in many countries, so day to day. Think food stalls, off the books labor, house cleaning, sex work for some who have no other means to survive. Other industries such as food service, entertainment, tourism, all hit so hard by the pandemic. And women and transgender people were definitely hit harder. I want to just draw your attention to the slide I have here. Millicent Chiang is from, sorry, I'm just going to make this a little bigger for me. From Kenya, and she says most LGBT people live from hand to mouth and can't afford to stay indoors because this would mean they don't have any money or food. As much as possible, as much as people try to be cautious, there's a level of carelessness, not because they want to, but because they have to. And I think we've heard this this kind of theme a lot for people really living on the margins, is having to choose between protecting themselves against the virus or working to be able to survive. The other photo here is of a lesbian couple in the Philippines. They live in a sort of a compound of other households, and when the district officer providing food packs was coming around in their district and offering food packs to households, they were the only household in that compound that was refused. And they were refused because they did not have a husband living on the premises, or any children. So this is what one of them said about that. I felt belittled, and I was thinking, what would happen to us if we were living on our own and renting a place? How would we be able to sustain ourselves? The point being there that the other households shared their food with them. Another story I just want to quickly mention before we go on is in Sri Lanka. We learned that in Colombo, the food support being provided was actually being distributed from police stations. In Sri Lanka, same-sex relations is still criminalized. So that was really actually the very last place that queer people were going to go to get the support that they might need. Next slide, please. The next theme, also very prominent, was the issue of disruptions in healthcare access and reluctance to seek care. Again, keep in mind, I think I mentioned it briefly earlier, that our communities have had terrible experiences with healthcare systems around the world. Stigma, discrimination, refusal to care, outing, misgendering, breaches in confidentiality. These are all common, unfortunately, experiences. The kinds of sub-themes that we saw in our interviews with people, first was delays in healthcare seeking. So this is understandable given what I just described. Even in the best of circumstances, people do delay seeking care. And now, of course, it has much more dire consequences. Another aspect to this was disruptions in access to HIV-related medications. And there are actually more and more studies coming out showing the disruption to HIV programming. And it wasn't just because supply chains were necessarily being interrupted, they were, but early on, it was actually more about no longer being able to get to the dispensary clinics or other services that were providing antiretrovirals. So public transport being shut down, for example, in Uganda, meant that unless you had money and had a private car, you couldn't get anywhere. Another sort of sub-theme in this particular area is disruptions in access to hormone therapies and other gender-affirming care, which was deemed non-essential in many places. So transgender people and intersex people as well who rely on hormonal therapy to really maintain their quality of life were left without. I just want to point out in this slide I have here, starting on the left, this is a group of activists from Wuhan, China, and we interviewed them, sort of after the fact of the really intense time of the outbreak there. But what they told us was that during the lockdown, we helped obtain medication for 80 to 90 persons per day, about 800 bottles. We also helped HIV positive persons who are sick but cannot go to the hospitals, which were overwhelmingly full of COVID-19 patients. So again, this example to me really highlights the sort of creativity about what needs to happen in a crisis as you start organizing as a community. The middle picture is Naya Rajab, a Syrian refugee in Lebanon. And she says, I'm surrounded by LGBTI individuals who lack access to basic rights and medical services to survive this period. The services provided by the state already do not include LGBT communities on a normal basis, and now it's even worse. And then on the right, that's Lua Stabile, who's with the Union of Travesti and Trans Women in Brazil. And she said to us, if trans people have viruses and go to a hospital, people will be discriminatory. People will not choose to save trans lives when people have to choose who lives. I do not doubt that we are the people who will be discarded from medical care. I just would like to add here that our qualitative findings are consistent with a survey that was undertaken by a US group called the Movement Advancement Project, published a couple of months ago. That their study found that nearly 40% of LGBTQ households reported that they weren't able to get medical care or delayed getting medical care, compared to 19% of non-LGBT households. Next slide, please. So the next theme, which I think we've also heard quite a lot about in this country, is the elevated risk of family and domestic violence. Interviewees reported to us either feeling at increased risk themselves or knowing others at increased risk of violence and abuse within their homes due to forced cohabitation, for example, with unsupportive family members or abusive partners during quarantines and lockdowns. Ephraim here is from Sri Lanka. And he told us, in one case, parents of a gay man discovered him holding hands and being close with his boyfriend inside the house. The parents kicked him out almost immediately. I helped him find temporary housing with friends in the LGBT community. A couple of other examples, a lesbian woman from Singapore told us, some cases come through on a Facebook chat group I moderate. There have been several emergency requests for housing by lesbians who are scared to live at home because of emotional and physical violence from their parents. They're asking friends if they have spare rooms to take them in. And then a woman who runs a service organization in St. Lucia in the Caribbean told us A 24-year-old, oops, sorry, my screen did a funny thing. A 24-year-old trans woman shared that her mother insisted she wear male clothing and cut her hair while in her mother's house, or her mother will put her out during curfew, which would mean she would be arrested and sent to jail to face greater dangers. Next slide, please. So this is, of course, related to the theme of risk of violence, but social isolation and increased anxiety. You know, for most people, including all of us, probably the new reality of, well, not even that new anymore, but the reality of physical distancing is certainly challenging. And we're all feeling it. I'd actually certainly much rather be on the PLU campus doing this talk. But for LGBT people who are already isolated from their chosen families, who feel unable to be out, who may not have access to supportive communities, the isolation and the forced cohabitation with potentially unsupportive families is extremely challenging, bringing increased anxiety, discomfort, traumatic memories, and risk of violence. Anxiety is exacerbated by socioeconomic stress and by health status, particularly for people living with HIV who may feel especially vulnerable to COVID. The safe havens that many LGBTIQ people have created or found are not accessible right now. And so Billie Bryan is a trans woman in the Cayman Islands. And she told us there are LGBT people who are suffering with mental health illnesses who rely on community sports for support for their well-being. Having those social networks completely destroyed in a matter of days has been detrimental. When we're forced to stay with people who are unaccepting and even abusive, it puts us at higher risk for anxiety, depression, insomnia, self-harm, and suicidal ideation. Next slide, please. It's fairly predictable that in times of crisis, our communities get blamed and scapegoated, leading to heightened stigma, discrimination, and sometimes violence. It's a pretty familiar refrain, whether related to the HIV pandemic, to Hurricane Katrina, Cyclone Winston in Fiji, the Haitian earthquake, or the Ebola outbreak. During the Ebola crisis, LGBTIQ people were physically attacked by others who believed that Ebola was brought down on them as God's punishment for tolerating so-called homosexuality. And it's happening again with COVID in Ghana, Kenya, Liberia, Russia, Uganda, Ukraine, and the US. Thank you, Pat Robertson. In Ghana, this is Davis Makayala, who's an interfaith, runs an interfaith organization, LGBT organization in Accra. And he told us the chief Muslim cleric here in his address on COVID-19 said that this is a punishment from God for LGBT people. The national attitude about LGBT people is creating more discrimination and stigma, and the community is in a panic. Whenever there's a disaster, the LGBT community is blamed by religious leaders. The rhetoric is creating fuel for more hostile situations. I think the pandemic has drawn us 3 years backwards from where we made progress. I also would just mention in Liberia, a place where I was working actually quite a bit when the pandemic started. A trans woman I was working with said to me, being seen as the cause of the outbreak makes us a target. I'm concerned about my safety and the safety of other LGBT people. Some of us are frontline activists and we are all well known in Liberia. We can face an attack at any time. Next slide, please. Abuse of state power is another theme that came up, of course, depending on where one lived, but a number of countries around the world have used COVID-19 as a sort of cover for cracking down broadly on free speech and assembly and targeting certain populations. For example, in Uganda, back in sort of April, May area, young men from a shelter for homeless queer youth in Kampala were arrested and for so-called violating social distancing mandates. They were actually in a shelter. That's where they lived. And they spent nearly 2 months detained in jail because of that. In Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orban declared a state of emergency and has, I believe, still has the power to unilaterally suspend existing laws for an indefinite period. Early in the pandemic, his government quickly passed a law that prohibits transgender people from legally changing their gender. And in Liberia, a member of the legislature declared his intentions to put forward a law that would actually strengthen the existing criminalization law. And in other countries, military, there was a heavy military response to clear streets, and often in the clearing of those streets, LGBT people would be caught up in their abuse. This is a broader issue, but I just wanted to note that Human Rights Watch recently put out a report that said that since January 2020, at least 83 governments have used the COVID-19 pandemic as an opportunity to silence critics and adopt new repressive laws that criminalize speech. And so I just draw your attention to Mikhail Tumasov, who's chair of the Russian LGBT network in Russia, although he's actually out of Russia at the moment. But what he says is, what worries me most as a human rights defender is the ease with which even democratic countries have imposed thoroughly undemocratic measures, the speed with which borders were closed, and an us versus them rhetoric emerged. This is a heyday for authoritarian and totalitarian regimes like Russia. It makes it seem like authoritarianism works in times of crisis, while showing democracies as fragile, even if it's only in the short term. I'm not going to say much about the US response and how it fits into that picture, but it does. All right, next slide. Last theme I want to touch on has to do with concerns that about organizational survival, about what is actually the impact of COVID on the ongoing fight for justice and equality. And what we heard was a clear concern about setbacks in the movement. Many interviewees spoke of the existential threat that the COVID-19 pandemic is posing to their movements, with some stating directly that they were being set back by years, as Davis Makayela mentioned in that quote. And this is due to slowdowns or stoppages in critical advocacy work. When things that happen, like what is happening or what happened in Hungary or in Liberia, normally the community would mobilize to advocate against those things, but in the current circumstances, it's very difficult to do that. There's also a lot of concern about the uncertainty of continued donor support. People really were worried that donors would shift away from supporting more broad-based support to focus on COVID, and that also that they were concerned because they weren't able to implement some of the activities that they were contracted, so to speak, obligated to do. So I just want to again highlight a couple of quotes here. Yelena Vasilievich is from Serbia with the Equal Rights Association for the Western Balkans and Turkey. And what she said is, the pandemic has set us back 10 years. LGBT issues were already a topic that policymakers didn't want to tackle in this region. I fear that our issues will be deprioritized even after the crisis is over. The government will continue using the pandemic, the economy, and recovery efforts to avoid tackling human rights issues. The human rights of LGBT people will come last. And Felicia Brown Acton, who's a woman from Niue, a small South Pacific island country. Actually, she lives in New Zealand now. She told us, I worry that we're going to become more invisible in the bigger political picture. Our fight and our politics are no longer going to be factored in to the extent that they have been. Our challenges will be diluted. I'm worried that our rights and the things harmful to us will no longer be a priority anymore, that we will become insignificant to government priorities overall. Once you become invisible, you become voiceless. Several interviewees did describe how they managed to mobilize emergency food support, psychological support, since the shutdowns began. And I want to mention that because even in some of the most hostile settings, LGBT communities continuously demonstrate really incredible resourcefulness and resilience in maintaining commitment to their fight for equality and to supporting their communities. So based on our findings, we have a whole set of recommendations. I'm not going to go into them. They've been guiding our advocacy work for the last 10 months or so. I can certainly talk more about them in the Q&A if you're interested. But what I want to shift to right now just briefly is to say that you know, what we did realize pretty quickly as we did these interviews and as we continued to scan what was happening is that if we didn't help our communities around the world, it was likely very few people would. And this has turned out to be true. And I just point to, again, a recent report from the Global Philanthropy Project, conducted an analysis of COVID or resources going to support LGBTI communities during COVID. This is what they found. This is a report that just came out a few weeks ago. Of 4,467 recorded resource flows addressing COVID-19, only one explicitly described funding to support LGBTI communities. None, 0, of the almost 3,000 recorded resource mechanisms tracked to the UN's Global Humanitarian Response Plan explicitly described funding to support LGBTI communities. Similarly, a search of the DevEx funding database, which tracks international development funding activity, found 0 results on funding to address the impact of COVID on LGBT communities. Next slide, please. But before we even had this information, I mean, this is new information, we decided back in May, June, that we would launch a global COVID-19 LGBTIQ emergency fund. We immediately started to fundraise, and we were initially able, much to our astonishment, over the subsequent months, we raised about $1 million. We put out calls for proposals well before we actually had that money in hand, but we had enough to start. Within 3 weeks of putting out the call for proposals, we received nearly 1,500 qualified applications from 131 countries, totaling $12 million in need. And this was with average request amounts of $7,450. So far, we've issued 121 grants in 63 countries and distributed just over $1 million. And I'm really happy to say we've raised a bit more over the last 4 or 5 months, and we have just released a new call for proposals just a couple of weeks ago. And the deadline for those applications is March 26th. So if you want to spread the word about that in your networks, if you want to support the fund itself, please go to our website. You'll see information about that. Next slide, please. So I just want to show quickly, this is based on the requests that we got in terms of priority needs. And what we see actually really mirrored what we learned through our qualitative research, which is here you see in the left pie chart that 57% of requests were related to food support, which is quite astonishing. And then you see that most of the requests were for the sort of broad community, but there was also a relatively high percentage of requests from trans and non-binary populations. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide. I'll end with this, but with this last slide, I just wanted to share a message that we got from a group in Fiji, the Youth Champs for Mental Health in Fiji, who received some of our support. And this is not so much to pat ourselves on our back, but really to highlight what they use the funds for. What they What they said was that recently discrimination towards the LGBT community peaked. And that apparently was because one of the first cases was from someone within the community. Yet the community was excluded from emergency assistance. Through the support from Outright Action International, we were able to feed our community, pay for housing, food, utilities, and cover medical expenses. This is the silver lining that has reaffirmed our hope for our survival, that together we can make it through this crisis and we don't need to struggle in silence. This sentence, that we don't need to struggle in silence, this phrase really captures why we do this work, and not just the emergency COVID work, but really the long, hard fight for equality and justice around the world for everyone. Because no one should have to struggle in silence or in the shadows, and because everyone deserves to live with dignity. And I think those are values too that Chris really reflected in his work. So I thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to getting some questions from you. Thank you.
Ami, can you hear me?
I can.
Yes, I just can't. For some reason, I can't see myself. So here, just hold on one second. There
Okay.
I am. Hi. First of all, you know, there's something about virtual presentations. I really miss the applause. And so I just want us to both take a few minutes to just imagine a hall full of very enthusiastic attendees applauding for such a wonderful and compelling presentation. Thank you so much for a very informative,
thank you.
A very, very informative presentation. I think it's going to leave us with a lot to think about. So thank you very, very much. We do have some questions that coming from the audience, and we certainly invite those of you that haven't asked questions to just write them in the Q&A section, and Ami will do what she can to respond. So can you see them? I think I'll just read them to you, Ami, so you don't have to focus on that. So the first two come from a PLU alum from 01, Evan Olson. One is to share the sources and the academic citations. So in a minute, Evan, I'll be happy to post the link to the study from which Ami was referencing a lot of her information. And Evan's second question is, considering the discrimination that LGBTIQ plus people experience around the world, how did you find your study participants?
No, it's a good question, and really it comes from years and years of building trust. Outright has been around since 1990, so a good long time, and over the years we've really prioritized working, you know, in solidarity with many groups, shoulder to shoulder. And so our staff, which is not big, we have a staff of about 20 people, but we're around the world. There's a core in New York, and a few of us scattered around the US, but otherwise outside of the country. And so it was really mobilizing our networks, and making sure, of course, the do no harm principle in this work is paramount. And so we essentially used word of mouth and kind of a snowball sampling approach in this case, but really based on years of long time, you know, relationships and partnerships in many different places.
Thanks, Ami. So the next question comes from Margaret Chell. Can you speak more about working with and interviewing LGBTIQ plus people in places where it is criminalized or highly stigmatized? How do you earn their trust and ensure their safety?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what I just said answers that question as well. And it is, I think the way that Outright works, which I really appreciate, and which I think Peace Corps volunteers in particular will appreciate, is working very much in partnership. We do not the priorities that we have in any given setting are absolutely set by our local partners, and we only are there if we are invited to be there and they need the support. And so that's one thing, is that way of working over the years is how we have built trust. To your point specifically about criminalized settings, you know, it really varies across those 68 countries. There's a whole diversity of the ways in which people feel that criminalization. In some countries, it's not particularly prominent or acted upon, but it can be kind of randomly. And so you always live with that anxiety that could be pulled out as a reason to, you know, to hassle you. But many of these laws are about their legacies of particularly of British colonial rule. So the old anti-sodomy laws and this kind of thing, they're actually focused on behavior, not identity. And so for that reason, you will be amazed at how vibrant or maybe you won't be, but a lot of the movements in countries where same-sex relations are criminalized have some of the most vibrant movements. Look at Kenya, for example. Even in Uganda, which has gotten a lot of press, some of the most I don't know, savvy activists in the world are in that part of the sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So it's not there's no short answer, but it is sort of built on years and years of work and partnership and solidarity.
Thanks, Ami. And unless any other questions come in, I have a question for you, which
sure.
As I hear you describe the work of Outright International, the focus really seems to be on direct support, organizing support, material support for organizations that support the visibility and health justice of all of these different communities all over the world. And I'm wondering, you know, part of the underlying assumption, it sounds, or the sense that I get, is that much of this problem is perpetuated by the healthcare industry, the healthcare professionals. And I'm wondering if the organization or other organizations within the United States and globally are focusing on how to better serve these populations all over the world, and who's doing a good job, who isn't doing a good job, you know, or maybe just nobody is. I don't know.
No, it's a good question. I won't name and shame, but I do think you know, there certainly are in you know, the U.S. and a number of other countries around the world, there's a great deal of attention now to culturally competent care that includes competent care with LGBTIQ people. So there are good models out there that could be adopted potentially. And I think in the realm of HIV work, you see that more globally through health and development work because of the HIV pandemic. In fact, it's really through HIV related activism that LGBT people became more visible. I mean, it took a long time, even within the HIV global response. Our communities, men who have sex with men, gay men, bisexual men, transgender people were really, really overlooked and still marginalized, but that's changing. And so there are models out there that can be used. I think that, you know, Outright, ironically, we're not actually a health organization per se, we're a human rights organization. And so we really focus on sort of trying to move the needle in a big way, both in terms of this global advocacy that we do at the United Nations. Outright is the only US-based LGBT rights organization that has observer status in the Economic and Social Committee of within the UN. So we can be kind of a watchdog, and we take that role very seriously. What I was trying to, I think, get across is that unfortunately, we still remain invisible and off the radar of so many organizations that do health and development work around the world. And this is just, it's just got to change. It's, and you know, even in, you know, these communities also see that, they feel it and they know it too. It's not like me from the outside saying this. This is a perennial. The only money that comes through development and health is for HIV. Very important money. That's not the point. But it excludes a whole set of populations that have been left without access to decent health care.
So a question came in from Rebecca Hemphill, which I think you addressed.
Okay.
I work with healthcare. I recently heard a news report on how in the US, the bandwidth in healthcare to address any other topic than the crisis of COVID surges, hospital overwhelm, triaging care is just not there. What have you and your organization found possible in speaking to healthcare systems and providers to inform and support appropriate care for the LGBTQI plus individuals suffering and or recovering from COVID?
Yeah, so let me just clarify. We're not necessarily speaking directly with healthcare providers. We're trying to reach the agencies and organizations that are doing that work. And so I've done many talks. We've done some publications, spin-off webinars and media pieces, and trying to get the attention of the you know, the broader community of people involved in COVID response. You know, sometimes we feel like we're spitting in the wind, to be honest, but I think we just have to keep trying, and we have to keep highlighting what the experiences are to the extent that we can help lift up the stories that we're hearing, so people are becoming, you know, are aware of the ways that that different communities, and you know, I'm speaking specifically, obviously, about the LGBT communities around the world, but I mean, so there's so many other marginalized populations too that are not sufficiently being addressed in this pandemic, and there has to be a better, you know, there has to be efforts put into to improving the response. And everybody's overwhelmed, we know that, and yet it's just so crucial. People's lives are hanging in the balance.
Thank you for that clarification. I think it's helpful for all of us in our audience. And then we have, I see it as, it's our final question, and it's sort of a PLU question because it really speaks to your vocation and your trajectory. But what do you wish you'd known when you were starting out in your line of work that you've learned along the way? And I think
wow. That's a great question. What do I wish I had known? I mean, that implies that maybe what I appreciate about my sort of development in this field is that I am so incredibly inspired every day by the strength and resilience of the people that I get to work with. And it's not exactly answering your question. It's not like I didn't think I would, but I have to say that I really am, it's my lifeblood is to be able to work with really courageous people and play a part, if I can, in highlighting those struggles and helping us all work, as I said, for dignity. And so what do I wish? I wish, you know, I actually wish I'd started sooner. I don't know, because I kind of came late to activism in this way in my career, and I really wish that I had started sooner.
Thank you so much. But, you know, you started, and certainly from where we sit as we listen to your story and hear the review of your report, we're just very grateful for all the work you're doing. And I speak on behalf of the invisible audience right now in thanking you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
We're very grateful and very privileged for your presence. And I have a hunch that you'll be back on our campus at some point, because I think this topic needs continued attention. So Ami, on behalf of PLU, thank you so much.
I would be, yeah. Thank you so much. I'd be happy to. And Tamara has my email. If students want to reach out to me, I welcome that.
Great. So this is the very, these endings on Zoom are so abrupt. I don't like them. You can't sort of sit and chat, but all good things have to come to an end. So we're gonna end by showing the slideshow that we showed at the beginning and giving folks some time to enter some comments in the chat. And good evening, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us this evening. Ami, take care, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
My pleasure.